They took its picture and laughed. A grainy photograph, taken from the air or through a telephoto lens, caught a carrier that looked wrong to the eye. Scarred plating where smooth curves should have been, a mast twisted like a coat hanger, a flight deck riddled with black scars, and a sagging island that looked more like a makeshift hut than the spine of a battle fleet. In a world that prized sleek lines and the clean geometry of naval engineering, the ship in that frame read as ugly, awkward, damaged, somehow defeated. On the deck, just after dawn, the smell told the true story. Smoke had burned itself into the steel. The tang of aviation fuel hung low over the wreckage like a second fog. A puddle of hydraulic oil gleamed under a bent arresting wire. A sailor's knuckled hand, scraped and blackened, fumbled with a bolt until the fingers bled. Somewhere below, an engine coughed and refused to catch, a small mechanical profanity against the vastness of the Pacific. They called her ugly, the narrator might say, and a foreign radio somewhere on the other side of the map answered with a kind of celebration, words that turned a photograph into propaganda. There was relief in that voice. There was triumph. An island of the American fleet, wounded and shown to the world, made into a symbol of decline. The taunt wasn't purely aesthetic. It was an argument, posed as ridicule. The enemy suggested that this ship, once feared, could be cast aside. That is the moment the story begins, not with a victory, but with an assumption. The assumption that a single picture, a single strike, could decide more than it actually did. The assumption the Japanese propaganda made, if indeed those taunts were broadcast as reported, presumed a simple arithmetic. Damage plus dereliction equals defeat. They saw a wounded hull and concluded a navy was broken. If that assertion of mocking radio broadcasts or newspaper commentary is later found to be missing or garbled in the sources, mark it indefinito. What matters in this narrative is not the exact line of a single broadcast, but the broader pattern. An enemy triumph declared in public, a morale-boosting headline built on an image, and the confidence behind it. Whether the phrase belonged to a particular announcer, which newspaper carried it, or whether the caption was a translation approximated from propaganda, those are verifiable details to settle in research. For the purposes of the story that follows, the photograph and the taunt serve as the open accusation. The ship had been dismissed. Inside that battered hull, the crew did not collect their belongings and leave. They did not watch the broadcast with a partisan's despair. They breathed the same heavy air, wiped their hands on the same oil-stiff cloths, and set about the small, stubborn work of making broken things whole.
Damage control was not a gesture. It was a profession performed with the deliberate rhythm of people who had rehearsed the worst and accepted it as a possible tomorrow. Patches were cut, rivets hammered, pumps manned. A petty officer barked orders about shoring up a bulkhead. A young sailor, pressed back against the railing, felt a nausea that went beyond seawater and salt. This was the taste of survival on the edge. That survival was not a miracle of will alone. It would be easy, in retelling, to sentimentalize the grit in those hands. The truth is more structural. The ship's ability to endure was embedded in a system that extended far off the horizon. Shipyards on the mainland, repair crews organized like medical corps, tankers and barges full of fuel, spare propellers and engines stored in warehouses that smelled of grease and cedar. The drama of a single deck plate gave way to the arithmetic of barrels and bolts. Before the day was done, tugboats would come alongside. A flotilla of support vessels, the quiet, ordinary workhorses of a navy, would push and pull a wounded warship toward safety. Men in coveralls, not captains in gold braid, made the math of return possible. Welders, stokers, ordnance technicians, electricians. Each repair was a vote against the assumption that a photograph could be the end. If you love deep dive history, hit subscribe and you'll find more stories like this. The carrier itself is central to the Pacific narrative because carriers were not merely ships, they were mobile factories of violence, aircraft, maintenance facilities, fuel stores, and the personnel to keep it all operating. To lose a single carrier in battle was to take a visible hit. To lose multiple carriers in a matter of months would have been catastrophic. But industrial abundance changes the nature of catastrophe. When one nation can accelerate the replacement, repair, and rearming of its fleet on a scale the enemy cannot match, then the meaning of a single strike shifts. Damage becomes temporary, attrition becomes survivable. Here, though, it is necessary to pause and note the line between verified fact and reconstruction. The ship at the center of this account, identified in some narratives as Enterprise, and sometimes associated with a particular engagement or raid, must be treated carefully. The specific incident where Japanese sources allegedly labeled her ugly, the exact date of an attack, the number of planes launched in the strike that followed, these details must be resolved against archival records. Any of those facts that remain unconfirmed in primary sources should be considered indefinito until research verifies them. The broader pattern, enemy mockery versus industrial response, does not require the inventoried certainty of every number, but good history does. Those indefinito placeholders will stand where precision is still owed.
The attack itself, reconstructed from the angle of the ship's crew and from damage reports, reads like a staged collision. Aircraft arrive in a ragged V, their silhouettes backlit on the morning sky. Bombs strike with a dull, surgical violence that rearranges tonnage and life together. A bomb punches through the flight deck and detonates in a hangar. Flames climb like ink stains. Planes that cannot move are caught, their wings like helpless birds. The deck erupts, a catwalk shears off. Men shout across the din of alarms, flak, and the clanging of metal. A lookout, pressed to binoculars that might as well be a window to fate, calls down through the chain of command that the elevator is jammed, that a plane's fuel is feeding a small inferno. These are scenes of chaotic, immediate danger. The language is small, a hose kinked, a hand burned, a boot swallowed by a puddle of used oil. These details anchor the viewer because they are the human scale inside an industrial system. But as the action unfolds, the macro choices reshape the meaning of every small gesture. Where will replacement fuel come from? Which shipyard will accept a crippled carrier? How quickly can a spare engine be shipped across thousands of miles of ocean? These are not questions answered on the deck in the first hours. Their resolution depends on logistics and policy, on infrastructure and the willingness to prioritize resources. Across the ocean, in machine sheds and at wharves where industrial light met night, the conversation was different. Shipyard clangor did not pause for propaganda. A welder in a dry dock, call him simply the welder, pulled a grinding wheel against steel. The sparks that flew seemed to him like the same little suns that burned on a carrier's deck. He labored not because he hated the enemy more than sleep, but because the industrial machine had a rhythm of its own, an insistence that metal expect another life. A dispatcher at a depot filled requisitions by lamplight. A convoy left at midnight carrying crates of radio sets and replacement hydraulics. These were acts of routine heroism, the kind that reads dull in the heat of narration, but is decisive in outcome. The enemy's taunts often underestimated this mechanical life. Mockery assumes a single point of failure. It imagines that a broken hull is an irreducible algebra, one ship down, one fewer to count. But war, especially modern war, is not arithmetic in whole numbers alone. It is a calculus of sustainment. It is not merely how many carriers one loses, but how many can be returned, refitted, and launched again. If a nation can replace or repair quicker than the enemy can destroy, the balance of power shifts not because of battlefield genius, but because of industrial momentum.
Consider, generically, what that momentum looks like. Repair crews who can replace a damaged flight deck in weeks rather than months. Floating dry docks that swallow hulls and return them sealed and painted. Spare aircraft crated and transported by the thousands. Fuel pipelines and tankers that deliver the lifeblood of carrier operations. Taken together, these capabilities condense into predictability. Losses still hurt, they still cost lives and time, but the capacity to respond, swift, organized, massive, turns tactical victory into strategic ambiguity. This is not to say that the enemy lacked skill or will. Japanese naval pilots struck with accuracy and bravery. Their attacks inflicted the kind of chaos that could end careers, sink ships, and break decks. They deliberately targeted fighters on deck, fuel bunkers, and command centers, the very things that, if damaged at the right moment, could neutralize a carrier's power. In some instances, crews were ordered to scuttle or to deny facilities. In others, captains attempted to keep their ships afloat under impossible conditions. At times, denial tactics were cruel and final. Wrecks burned, stores destroyed, anything that might be of use to the opponent scoured by flame. Yet, when the enemy cheered the photograph and presumed the carrier's end, they often overlooked a different kind of resilience: abundance.
For the United States, the industrial base that had been mobilized years before meant that metal and men could be rematched in ways unthinkable a generation earlier. Shipyards went on working long after the morning papers stopped celebrating. Fuel still poured into forward anchorages. Supply trains, moving at odd hours through ports filled with cranes and crane shadows, carried tasks that were, in aggregate, more decisive than any single bombing run. From the perspective of a Japanese pilot or propagandist, this must have been bewildering. The image of a battered carrier was a psychological triumph. The visceral reaction, joy at a visible wound, made sense. But in war, triumph is not simply the seeing of damage. It is the capacity to convert damage into a lasting advantage. Mockery, as an act, required that the damage be meaningful in the long term. It required that replacement be slow, that supply lines break, that the labor of repair be insufficient. Where the industrial machine remained robust, the mockery was premature. Back on the carrier, the immediate work continued. Men worked at knots and rivets and threaded rods. A medic patched fingers and traded a damp towel with a man whose face looked older by an hour. A lieutenant stood over a map and drew a red line where flight operations might yet resume. The officer's decision, send the crippled ship to the nearest friendly anchorage or steam on toward a forward repair base, was tactical and logistical both. Towing a carrier is a slow arithmetic. Repairs can begin at sea in stages if there is enough fuel and spare parts aboard.
The choice revealed the larger system. Was there a floating dry dock within reach? Could the carrier be patched sufficiently to cross to a major shipyard? These determinations were not made in isolation. They depended on convoys, on the availability of tugs, on the readiness of repair gangs standing by in distant ports. Word of the damage would reach admirals and shore commanders as a string of reports and assessments. They read these in offices where coffee had gone cold and where a single phrase in a cable could rearrange priorities: urgent, salvageable, repairable, total loss. Each adjective carried resource consequences. Urgent might mean a floating dry dock diverted from one convoy to another. Salvageable might mean the allocation of a special hull repair team. Total loss could free up materiel for other operations. None of those words were declarations of fate. They were options. The decision to invest in recovery was itself strategic. A nation could choose to make a loss costly by denying repair resources, or it could choose to absorb loss and keep pushing forward. The latter requires abundance. There are emblematic images in this whole choreography. The tugboat, almost dwarfed beside the carrier's flank. The welder crouched over a seam, sparks like a second sunrise. A convoy of tankers threading through a gray morning. A mechanic cranking a spare engine into place, like a surgeon replacing a heart. Those small images assemble into a larger argument that warfare is built on systems, not only on moments of valor. Still, human beings anchor the story. A young sailor who had enlisted for the romance of ocean and sky found in those hours the difficult knowledge of endurance. He had watched colleagues go forward into the smoke and return black-faced and silent. He had seen a pilot stumble, bloodied, laughing in a kind of survival hysteria. He had placed a hand on a bulky, soot-coated fuselage and felt the heat of a machine that had cost many thousands of hours of work to build and would soon be worth 1,000 more to repair. His small private anger, at being called ugly, at being dismissed, was a seed that fed into a larger organizational response. That seed was not what repaired the flight deck, but it helped keep a team moving through exhaustion into triumph. The enemy, in their own theaters, practiced similar economies. They had skilled technicians, maintenance crews, and a culture of repair. Japan, for example, had a long tradition of naval engineering and a professional fleet, but sustaining a far-flung maritime empire in the face of increasing Allied pressure meant stretching resources thin. Resources that were finite could be consumed in one place and leave another exposed. Where American industry could, in the aggregate, draw on a continent of factories, the balance of available repair and replacement shifted.
Quantitative comparisons, damaged ships versus repaired ones, barrels of fuel consumed versus delivered, aircraft lost versus replaced, are where the debate can become granular. Those numbers are powerful, but also perilous if taken without scrutiny. In this script, any precise figure, how many barrels were delivered per week to a particular anchorage, how many days a repair slit required for a carrier's flight deck, must be flagged and checked. Where such numbers are known, they will appear later with citations. Where they remain indefinitive, that uncertainty will be acknowledged. The story does not rest on a single statistic. It rests on the structural reality that one side's industrial throughput outpaced the other's capacity for permanent denial. There is a particular kind of irony in watching a propagandist celebrate a photo of damage. It is a short-sighted jubilation that confuses appearance with outcome. The photograph is a slice of time. The outcome is measured across months. An enemy who boasts of a single wound misunderstands that war in the modern age is often a contest of supply schedules and dockyard timetables as much as of bullets and bombs. The laugh that rippled across enemy airwaves was in many cases a premature bookkeeping entry. Yet the narrative arc demands more than irony. It requires a reveal, a moment where the assumption, damage equals decline, frays against the reality of repair. The reveal will come through the mobilization of supply chains, through the methodical work of repair crews, through the slow tug of a wounded carrier toward a port that would not let her die quietly. Tow lines creaked, pumps spat salt water, and then steady streams. A floating dry dock, itself a marvel of maritime engineering, would accept the hull like a basin accepting a broken vessel, and over weeks return seams welded, decks straighter, systems tested and certified. At the same time, the enemy's celebration could produce perverse incentives. When a nation believes it has achieved a visible victory, resources may flow toward further offensives and away from the structural necessity required to consolidate gains. Propaganda that calls a ship ugly and presumed finished could elicit public relief and political pressure to push forward to exploit the moment in ways that stretch supply lines even thinner. Those strategic distortions, celebrations that precede consolidation, are as much a part of the story as the ship herself. Before the carrier could be declared refused, there would be a period of stark choices. Could the ship steam under her own power? Would the damage control parties hold enough to cross to a friendly anchorage? Did the nearest repair base have the capacity to lift and patch a carrier's hull? These questions are the hinge between the human microscenes and the industrial macrostructures. The men on deck answer with temporary measures, shoring, jerry-rigged pumps, and fuel tending.
The administrators answer by reallocating assets, ordering a floating dock diverted, tasking a repair crew to accompany a convoy with specialized gear, authorizing the transfer of spare aircraft and engines. Picture now a repair yard lit for labor. The carrier slides into a dry dock, propped like a patient on an operating table. Rivets are replaced. Deck plates are heated and hammered into tolerances that read like poetry to a shipwright. Cranes lift replacement gear that had been stored under tarpaulins and moved at night across the country. Men work in shifts, steam power and gasoline blending into a chorus of effort. A welder's glare is recorded in a close-up, molten metal dripping like bright detritus on the dock face. In the operator's log, the entry reads simple and bureaucratic, repairs underway. But in the lived sensory world, the sound is deafening, the sky streaked with smoke, the smell of metal and paint battling the odor of seawater. There is also a public dimension. A photograph of a ship going into a dock may arrive in enemy newspapers too, but with a different caption, evidence that a wounded foe is being healed. That sort of image cuts against the earlier mocking photograph. It does not erase the original taunt, but it complicates it. It asks the observer to reassess the arithmetic. The reversal from ridicule to reluctant admiration is not the same as celebration. It is an acknowledgement that industrial scale can be a strategic weapon as effective as any aircraft squadron. Not all repairs are identical. Some hull breaches can be plugged in days. Other damage to propulsion or flight control systems may require weeks. Certain avionics may be proprietary and require specific components that are not instantly available. Each bottleneck is a decision point. Prioritize the flight deck and defer engine repairs, or make the ship mobile at the cost of jet sortie capability. Those decisions, argued in supply rooms and command centers, are the slow movements that determine whether a ship will return to combatability in weeks or months. This is where the narrative tension of our story, poised between image and outcome, must hold. The enemy has declared the carrier to be an ugly relic. Crews and shipwrights have set to work to prove otherwise. Tugboats push, a convoy approaches with crates of replacement gear, a dockyard manager orders overtime, and the city around the yard responds with the labor to make it happen. But the next steps are not guaranteed. Where the enemy has not fully exhausted its capacity to strike, another blow could yet make repair impossible. Where logistics fail,
If, for instance, a key spare part is missing or a dry dock is itself damaged, the wounded ship could then become a true loss. At the hinge of these possibilities, the story pauses. The carrier lies in dry dock, her paint scoured raw in places, her island rebolted into something steadier.
Men work with precision and the urgency of people who know the stakes. An officer walks along the scaffolding, calling down to the welders with orders that are both crisp and habitual. On the bridge, a logbook sits open with an entry that is equal parts clerical and moral. Status, repairable. Priority, high. The future is not set. Somewhere across the ocean, enemy commentators may still celebrate the earlier photograph. In the yard, the welder's hands, blackened and steady, make a different kind of statement. This is the point where one could linger on a final image. Steel being hammered into shape, a tattered ensign reattached, a pilot running a hand across the fuselage of a repaired fighter as if testing a wound. But to understand the full drama, we must widen the lens again. The carrier's possible return will depend on more than welders and tugs. It will depend on pipelines and cargo manifests, on the tempo of convoys and the calendars of shipyards. It will depend on whether the nation's industrial engine can sustain such repairs while prosecuting an offensive elsewhere. And it will depend, too, on the psychology of abundance. Does a populace, seeing one ship repaired, believe in invincibility? Does an enemy, seeing a repaired ship steam again, read that image as proof that their mockery had been misplaced? These questions cannot be answered by one photograph or one dock. They are systemic, requiring data that must be checked and confirmed. Which shipyard took the work? How long did the repairs take? How many spare aircraft were flown in? What quantities of fuel and ordnance were restacked? Where those numbers are known, they will appear with sources. Where they are not, they remain marked indefinito. For now, the story rests at an inflection. The photograph that labeled a ship ugly has become more than a symbol, it is a provocation. It forced a response that revealed the scale of the industrial apparatus behind a Navy's projection of power. Men in coveralls worked into nights that smelled of oil and acetylene. Tug crews threaded the wounded through channels crowded with minesweeps and barges. Repair schedules were redrawn. Orders flowed like water through the pipes of a mobilized state. And in the rhythm of that flow lay a counter-argument to the enemy's laughter. If the narrative in later scenes will show the ship steaming back into action, reborn in paint and noise, those moments are preceded by this labor, the negotiation between human endurance and industrial throughput. It is in the hours that follow the photograph, among the sparks, the shouted commands, the paperwork, the tugs, that the ship earns the chance to refuse to sink. The ship earned that chance by the slow arithmetic of manpower, material, and stubborn procedure. In the dry dock, the work took on a ritual quality. Scaffoldings framed the hull like ribs around a patient. Men moved along them with practiced economy, handing tools and plates as if passing notes. Their faces were marked by the same grime the welder had carried for weeks. A foreman with a voice weathered by yelling orders notched time into the day. Seam by seam, plate by plate, a small victory at a time. The carrier's island was partially rebuilt in sections. Where fittings were too twisted, new brackets were bolted and riveted into geometry meant to last beyond the memory of the strike. There were decisions that resembled surgery. Replace the elevator hoists first, or prioritize fire suppression systems? Can avionics be reinstalled before the ship's power plant is declared seaworthy? Such choices were not merely technical, they mapped strategic priorities. If command wanted the carrier back on station to support an imminent operation, they accepted a shorter downtime and a limited capability. If they preferred a full overhaul, they risked missing a window of opportunity. Those trade-offs were made with cables and typewritten orders, with a clarity that sometimes surprised the men who carried out the work. At the top, decisions were accounted for on a ledger. On the deck, they were realized with sweat. In those ledger sheets, certain entries reappeared with a frightening regularity. Requisition for aviation fuel, transfer request for spare propeller shafts, emergency shipment of hydraulic pumps. The pipelines that fed forward anchorages operated like arteries. Tankers were scheduled months ahead. Deliveries were staggered to prevent bottlenecks. An entire calendar of supply ran beneath the daily drama on the carrier's deck. That calendar had been built in the months of mobilization and stretched during campaigns. It was not an accident that the ship in the dock received parts faster than an enemy aerial campaign could permanently remove them.
A tugboat captain remembered the first time he saw her afloat again, an image he carried, later in life, like a photograph folded into a wallet. He had watched from the quay as the dry dock gates opened at low tide, and water swallowed its cavity in a slow, patient gulp. The carrier rose on the bath, broached, took on a new weight. It was not a perfect resurrection. Seams still smoked where they had been closed, paint still flaked in ragged edges. But she rode higher in the water than she had in the photograph that mocked her. The captain had felt a rational kind of satisfaction. The job was technically correct. The ship would float. That, in war, is often the first victory. Sea trials followed as an uncertain right. Engineers checked main bearings and crankshafts. Electricians measured current draw from generators that had been rewired. A lieutenant paced the engine room, listening for the music of the ship's heartbeat. Each thump and vibration parsed into judgment. A mechanic, soot in his eyelashes, eased forward a spare pump onto its mount and spoke to it as if naming a patient.
When the engines coughed and then found their balance, there was a softness among the crew, a recognition that months of labor now had to be tested under the old, relentless law of the sea. The first steaming out of the dock was not cinematic in the way newspapers imagined. No brass bands played, no crowds cheered. It was a sober departure under gray clouds, tugs nudging her stern and bow as if escorting an animal that once had been broken. On deck, a small group of sailors stood with folded arms, their uniforms still streaked by dry dock soot. A petty officer clicked a clipboard shut and handed the log to a commander, who read it without much fanfare. The admiral's note would be short: return to operational control pending further checks. It was procedural and decisive both. Back in the enemy propaganda offices, the photograph remained a totem. The image that had been broadcast played on in the national imagination of the mocking nation. Its radio commentators still quoted the caption in speeches that praised audacity. But as the carrier steamed away from the dry dock, reports of her progress began to seep into the closed circuits of wartime intelligence. A small intelligence intercept here, a mention in a neutral port there. These were not front-page sensations abroad, but they mattered in the calculations of those who counted ships. For the adversary, the news of repairs would be received with a mixture of disdain and recalibration. Disdain for propaganda that had outpaced reality, recalibration because the industrial capacity that had made the repairs possible was not purely symbolic. This is where the argument grows granular and where historians must be careful with numbers. How long did repairs take? Which docks performed which tasks? How many tons of steel were replaced? How many man-hours expended? Some archives supply these figures in neat columns. Other answers arrive in the form of oral testimony that cannot be reduced to a single spreadsheet. Thus, the script keeps certain figures as indefinito, where primary verification is incomplete. What is not indefinito is the pattern. Repair timelines for damaged carriers in the American system of the era could be dramatically compressed compared to previous conflicts. This compression was the result of concentrated shipyard labor, pre-positioned spares, and the prioritization of naval assets in a national war economy. Work continued at multiple nodes. Supply convoys, often under escort, threaded across the Pacific. Floating dry docks moved like slow islands, some captured from peacetime yards, others towed by tugs over distances that would make generals nervous. Forward anchorages performed triage. Some ships returned to combat with patched armor and limited flight operations. Others were sent for deeper overhaul. The system allowed a staggering elasticity. Losing a ship in a particular battle did not mean that sustained maritime power would necessarily decline, provided the machinery of repair and replacement held. Individual acts of repair remained a human story. At night, when arc lights blinked in the dry dock, a young riveter remembered his father's advice: fit the piece right. We do it once, we don't come back. He worked with a partner whose laugh never quite returned. Together, they heated a stubborn plate until it bent to the bracket's will. When they bolted it down and the whole assembly took the strain, a small cheer, half exhausted, half exultant, rolled through their corner of the yard. These were the moments that blurred the line between industrial abstraction and human toil. There was also the business of aviation support. Planes lost on the carrier did not always return. Wings were crated in depots and shipped under tarpaulins. Pilots, when available, trained on replacement aircraft. Mechanics adapted instruments, cannibalized parts, and justified creative technical improvisations on the grounds of necessity. A squadron commander, writing later in an after-action report, described the relief of being handed a repaired fighter and the odd intimacy of a pilot running a hand along a newly painted fuselage as if it were an animal reburnished. Such small rituals mattered because air power is the visual punch of carrier warfare. A carrier restored without its planes is a hulking corpse. Another axis in the renewal was fuel. The carrier's operations required a steady flow of aviation and fuel oil. Tankers, long-range and slow, moved as if bound by gravity to the anchorages. There were convoys that stretched beyond the eye and pipelines that funneled through secure islands. The management of fuel was both logistical and political. Allocate too little to repairs and the ship might float, but not fly. Allocate too much and other fronts might suffer. Admirals and logistics chiefs argued these balances in stovepipes of communications that smelled of cheap coffee and the exhaustion of continuous decision-making. Enemies sometimes responded not solely with mockery, but with targeted campaigning to deny repair capacity. Strikes were mounted against anchorages and shipyards precisely because they understood that repairing capability was a force multiplier. When a yard was damaged or a dry dock sunk, the cost of repair for a carrier escalated. In some theaters, denial tactics, mines, bombardments, sabotage, made the difference between quick turnaround and permanent loss. Here again, the story requires caution when stating specifics. Where and when such secondary strikes occurred in relation to the repairs of this carrier are indefinito, pending archival confirmation. Nevertheless, the strategic logic is clear. Attacking repair nodes multiplies tactical success. As days turned into weeks, the carrier's crew rotated between tasks.
Pilots and mechanics ran tests on repaired aircraft. A signalman polished flags until they could be read from a distance. An electrician crawled through a conduit and swore softly when a wiring harness failed to match the schematic. They practiced flight deck drills with a hush that came from shared fatigue. Every recovered aircraft that landed without incident was another angel of function returned to the fleet. The soundscape of hydraulic pumps, of testing engines, of a wire snap and a curse shaped the emotional contour of this recovery. Then came the moment of true public visibility, a sortie. Not a headline-making strike, but a controlled operation meant to test the carrier's ability to put planes in the air and recover them. The deck hummed with cautious rehearsal. Pilots taxied to the catapults and launched into a sky that held the faint memory of the morning the ship had been wounded. Observers, naval officers, yard managers, sometimes local dignitaries, watched from a distance. When a fighter completed a clean landing and the arresting gear did what it was supposed to do, there was an almost imperceptible lifting of tension across the ship. Systems had synchronized. That sortie had tactical significance and narrative power. It delivered a symbolic retort to the mocking photograph. Here was a carrier that, at least on that morning, could project air power again. For the men who had sweated over the welds, it was vindication. For commanders, it was an operational signal. For propaganda, it complicated the earlier story. Yet rare is the victory that changes the contours of a conflict by itself. What the sortie did, more importantly, was to convert doubt into a calculable variable. It forced opponents to count the ship not as a lost asset, but as one they might have to face again. Enemy reaction varied. Some commentators doubled down on the photograph's narrative, insisting that repairs were cosmetic, that the carrier was still functionally diminished. Others, more sober, integrated the new reports into revised assessments of enemy capacity. Analysts, both military and civilian, recount the ebb and flow of perception. Propaganda that once cheered a visible wound had to account for the industrial response. In wartime, information is both an instrument and a weapon. A repaired carrier shifted that balance by reclaiming some of the informational battlefield. Beyond the immediate theater, the repair and return of the carrier fed into strategic calculations. Fleet formations adjusted, task groups were reconfigured with revised availability charts. A carrier's presence or absence changed the allocation of escorts and support vessels. In some operations, that single ship's availability meant the difference between deploying a full air group for escort and limiting missions to reconnaissance. Those operational chess moves were less flashy than combat footage, but no less decisive.
Some among the enemy may have viewed the restored carrier as a temporary inconvenience. Others recognized a deeper truth. Industrial resilience gave the United States an ability to sustain operations at scale that the adversary found increasingly difficult to match. The ship that had been mocked as ugly became a symptom of a broader mismatch. Not that bravery or skill were absent on either side, but that one industrial axis had the flexibility to absorb shocks and regenerate combat power. There is a humility in that regeneration, which the crew and repair crews often acknowledged privately. They knew that floating dry docks could be sunk, that convoys could be interdicted, that a different sequence of events might have rendered the repair impossible. They also knew that their labor was a link in a long chain. Welders, stokers, tugboat sailors, convoy escorts, logistics officers, all combined to make return possible. The carrier's refusal to sink was therefore not an act of miraculous will, but the product of a networked apparatus of sustainment. The final test of the ship's return came not in a single sortie, but in her reassignment to a task group and her participation in operations that mattered. When she steamed again among other carriers, when her fighters launched in support of amphibious landings or fleet actions, she no longer needed the photograph to define her. Her presence in a battle line was a running tally. She could score a sortie, recover aircraft, and continue the campaign. Observers, including historians later sifting through records, would read deployments and sortie logs to see whether the ship's participation was nominal or substantive. Where air groups flew multiple missions in sustained operations, participation was substantive. Yet the story keeps returning to the image, a photograph on a foreign radio broadcasting triumphant taunts, and to the mismatch between the photograph's claim and the industrial response. Those who mocked mistook visible damage for structural defeat. They mistook the superficial for the decisive. The carrier's eventual surfacing and return to duty did not erase the cost. Lives had been lost, machines destroyed, time consumed. But in the calculus of a sustained campaign, repair shifted the balance of loss. The broader lesson is not simply an indictment of mockery. It is a sustained argument about how modern war is waged. Firepower and courage are indispensable. So too are docks, railroads, cranes, and spare parts. When industrial throughput rises to meet demand, tactical gains can become pyrrhic. A navy that can repair and reconstitute forces shrugs off isolated losses in ways that change strategic possibilities. The ugly photograph, which once functioned as a morale-boosting artifact, became instead an example of misread conditions, an enemy celebrating a wound that the opponent's logistics would heal.
There is also a darker turn to consider. Repair does not absolve the pain and loss that preceded it. A rebuilt deck bears scars not only of metalwork, but of memory. Names of the dead are carved into plaques. Families await letters. Repair is a necessary response to aggression, but not a cure for grief. The narrative that admires industrial capacity must also remember the human toll that necessitated it. In the quiet that follows deployment, men aboard the carrier, officers and enlisted, mechanics and marines, tend to small rituals. A sailor cleans a brass fixture until it shines. A pilot pins a new ribbon onto his flight jacket. A welder receives a letter from home and folds it carefully. These acts are not triumphalist. They are the small stitches by which people restore a sense of order after chaos. They are also practical, maintaining morale, readying for the next mission, accepting that repair makes continued service possible. The ship's later operations, whether they included decisive sorties or steady patrols, are a matter for meticulous record-checking in archives and logs. Where those records remain indefinitive in this draft, they must be resolved with primary sources before publication. But the narrative arc does not require a single battle to make its point. The statement has been made. The visible wound, once broadcast as a symbol of decline, was countered by a system prepared to fix what was broken. The carrier refused to sink in the moral sense the enemy hoped for. Her absence as a fighting force did not materialize permanently because the industrial and logistical machinery returned her from the brink. As a concluding image, return to the deck at dawn, but now the morning is different. Paint is still tacky in places where touch-ups were applied, new rivets gleam where old ones were twisted.
A pilot, hair still damp from a wash and throat dry from the quiet, strides across the deck with boots that know the surface's history. He pauses at the rail, looks out at the sea where horizon meets possibility, and places a hand, without ceremony, on a section of steel that had been scarred months before. The gesture is small. The photograph that once made him a subject of derision is now an artifact in a larger story of repair and persistence. The title's promise is satisfied not by the theatrical overturning of a single scene, but by this concatenation of facts: a photograph mocked, men and systems mobilized, tugs and dry docks and fuel convoys committed, repairs executed, aircraft tested, sorties flown. The ugly epithet, hurled as rhetoric, lost its finality when weighed against industrial throughput and determined labor. In the contest between image and infrastructure, infrastructure proved decisive. For those who study war, the returned carrier offers a continuing lesson. Appearances can be deceiving. A photograph of damage does not equate to strategic defeat. What matters is the capacity to sustain, to repair, to replace.
In the modern age, that capacity is often more valuable than a single tactical success. If you want to dive deeper into the primary documents, logs, and shipyard records that underlie this story, check the description for the curated source list and our playlist on logistics in wartime. Watch the next video to follow the convoy routes and repair innovations that made such returns possible.